the 2025-2030 U.S. Dietary Guidelines, featuring an inverted pyramid and a push for high-protein red meat and full-fat dairy, conceal underlying public health crises and industry interest conflicts. Despite intense controversy, its core principle moving away from processed foods and returning to natural eating resonates with fundamental health values, sparking global debate. Why did the release of an official dietary guideline cause U.S. food giants' stocks to collectively decline while livestock companies bucked the trend? Why did the global nutrition community split evenly between praise and skepticism, with some consumer groups even launching an uncompromising version of the guidelines in direct opposition? On January 7, 2026, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Department of Health and Human Services jointly released the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2025 to 2030, making global headlines amid such controversies. This overhaul, dubbed a dietary paradigm shift, conceals complex dynamics between public health crises and industrial interests in the U.S., while reflecting profound transformations in global food production and health paradigms. The most immediate impact of these guidelines is the complete inversion of the decades-old food pyramid. Traditionally, grains form the foundation of the diet, occupying the broadest base of the pyramid. The new guidelines, however, place protein and fruits, vegetables at the core, relegating grains to the smallest segment. This visual upheaval instantly plunges the public into confusion. Should we cut back on whole grains? Is red meat truly safe to consume? Why has full-fat dairy suddenly overtaken low-fat options? In truth, these perplexities stem from America's long-standing, deeply entrenched dietary health crisis. Data reveals that over 70% of American adults are overweight or obese. Nearly one-third of adolescents suffer from prediabetes, and more critically, diet-related chronic diseases have compromised the quality of the U.S. military draft pool. A U.S. military report indicates that by 2025, 31% of eligible young Americans will be rejected for obesity, diabetes, and other diet-related conditions. This is the core reason why the current U.S. administration has elevated dietary restructuring to a public health policy priority. This guideline, crafted with a mission to save the day, has been marked by political maneuvering since its inception. Unlike previous editions, this version excludes considerations for environmental protection and sustainable food production. U.S. officials have even publicly stated that such environmental factors fall outside the core objectives. The new guidelines have two primary goals: reversing the nation's declining health trends while simultaneously supporting the development needs of domestic farmers, livestock producers, and the food industry. This orientation is explicitly stated in the guide's preface, explaining why its nutritional recommendations contain numerous seemingly contradictory statements. Notably, despite rumors that the guide lacks scientific backing, it was released alongside a corresponding scientific basis report. However, some content deviates from the original expert panel's recommendations due to conflicting interests. Public records indicate that during the guideline development phase, the current U.S. administration modified certain professional recommendations from the original panel and reconstituted the expert team to draft the guidelines. This led the consumer advocacy group, Center for Science in the Public Interest, to immediately release its own uncompromised version of the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, asserting that this alternative version represents a healthful eating pattern, fully grounded in scientific evidence and free from influence. This standoff between official and grassroots versions further highlights the controversy surrounding the revisions. Many who first saw the inverted pyramid mistakenly believed whole grains had become a reduced intake category. This is not the case. The guidelines simply placed refined carbohydrates like white rice and white flour squarely on the unhealthy blacklist. The daily recommended intake for whole grains remains 2 to 4 servings, whereas the previous guidelines recommended 3 to 6 servings for adults. While this appears to be a reduction, it is actually a precise adjustment to the structure of carbohydrate intake. Under U.S. measurement standards, 1 serving of whole grains equals 1 ounce, equivalent roughly the amount in 1 slice of standard sliced bread. Single-serving packets of oats commonly consumed today often exceed this equivalent per packet. This underscores that the new guidelines do not aim to reduce whole grain intake but rather to completely eliminate refined carbohydrates, which offer minimal nutritional value and can trigger significant blood sugar fluctuations. The true core change is the high-protein diet's official center stage debut in these guidelines. The daily protein intake recommendation for adults has jumped from 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight in the previous version to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, representing a 50% to 100% increase. This adjustment magnitude is unprecedented in the history of U.S. Dietary Guidelines. Even more surprising is that red meat has been included for the first time in the list of recommended high-quality protein sources, breaking the 40-year-long dominance of eggs, milk, and seafood as the primary sources of high-quality protein. This change has become one of the most controversial points in the guidelines. From a nutritional science perspective, the recommendation for red meat is not entirely without basis. Results from the Jackson Heart study, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022, revealed that after nearly a decade of tracking 3,242 African Americans, total meat and processed meat intake showed no significant association with cardiovascular disease outcomes. Only when unprocessed red meat consumption exceeded 3 servings per week did the risk of stroke significantly increase. However, this study's conclusions do not fully support the guidelines' recommendations. The American Heart Association explicitly questioned the findings, noting the study's sample was limited to African Americans and did not account for how different cooking methods affect red meat's nutritional value, making it unsuitable for extrapolation to the entire U.S. population. More critically, the World Health Organization previously classified red meat as probably carcinogenic to humans, stating that excessive consumption increases colorectal cancer risk, a position that conflicts with the direction of the new American guidelines. This has sparked a divide within the nutrition community. One camp argues that given the current widespread protein deficiency among Americans, moderately increasing red meat consumption could help build muscle mass and stabilize blood sugar levels. The other camp expresses concern that the saturated fats in red meat may elevate cardiovascular disease risks, posing particular threats to individuals with pre-existing health conditions. Recommendations for dairy products also underwent a complete reversal. Low-fat and skim milk, long held as the gold standard for decades, have faded into the background, while unsweetened whole milk has taken center stage. The guidelines recommend adults consume 3 servings of whole milk daily, equivalent to approximately 710 to 720 milliliters. This dosage standard clearly accommodates the needs of the U.S. domestic livestock industry. America is the world's largest dairy producer, with whole milk accounting for 68% of total output by 2025. This adjustment has been interpreted by observers as direct support for the dairy industry. From a nutritional science perspective, this adjustment holds some validity. Existing research confirms that milk fat in whole milk contains beneficial components like conjugated linoleic acid, which may aid in regulating blood lipids. Additionally, whole milk provides greater satiety, helping control overall calorie intake. However, the critical constraint on saturated fat remains unchanged. The new guidelines maintain the previous strict limit. Saturated fat should not exceed 10% of total daily caloric intake. For an adult consuming 2,000 kcal per day, this translates to a maximum of 22 grams. Calculating that each 100 milliliters of whole milk contains 3.2 grams of saturated fat, 710 milliliters of whole milk alone provides 22.7 grams of saturated fat, slightly exceeding the limit. Pair this with other dairy products like cheese or yogurt, plus a small amount of red meat, and this threshold can be easily surpassed. This is like placing a glass dome over red meat and butter consumption, visually accessible, yet easily breached with the slightest carelessness. The guidelines also relax restrictions on healthy fats, explicitly recommending they be obtained from whole natural foods. Meat, eggs, whole milk, avocados, and olive oil are all listed as recommended sources of healthy fats. Even butter and ghee are included in the list of cooking oils, with the sole emphasis being that olive oil should be the first choice for cooking. This shift overturns the long-held belief that all animal fats are harmful, yet it has also sparked new debates. The American Heart Association points out that butter and ghee contain over 60% saturated fat. Excessive intake can elevate LDL cholesterol, increasing the risk of atherosclerosis, particularly for individuals with hypertension or coronary heart disease. Supporters of the guidelines, however, argue that natural animal fats contain fewer harmful substances compared to industrially refined vegetable oils and provide richer sources of fat-soluble vitamins. In reality, this statement isn't entirely freewheeling. It corrects the widespread use of trans fats like hydrogenated vegetable oils in the U.S. market. Over decades, the American food industry extensively employed hydrogenated oils in processed foods, leading to excessive trans fat intake and severe cardiovascular health issues. The guidelines' endorsement of natural fats, in a sense, refutes industrially processed fats. The most stringent aspect of the new guidelines is undoubtedly the restrictions on added sugars and non-nutritive sweeteners, representing the strictest standards to date. They directly classify both as roadblocks to health, explicitly stating that no amount of added sugars or artificial sweeteners should be included in a healthy diet. Rigorous standards are set. Adults should consume 10 grams of added sugars per meal and is less than or equal to 30 g per day. Children under 10 are strictly prohibited from consuming any added sugars, while those under 4 should avoid them entirely. The severity of these standards surpasses many expectations. Consider that a single 500 milliliters can of regular carbonated beverage contains 55 grams of sugar, far exceeding the daily limit. Similarly, a single stir-fry dish with caramelized sugar in Chinese cuisine often easily surpasses the recommended intake. More concerning is the hidden added sugar in highly processed foods like bottled beverages, flavored yogurts, and various sauces, which constitute the primary sources of added sugar intake. Data from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention indicates that by 2025, the average daily added sugar intake among American adults will reach 78 grams, 2.6 times the recommended upper limit in the new guidelines. This is a significant factor contributing to the high prevalence of diabetes and obesity in the United States. However, it must be objectively noted that the guidelines' blanket rejection of non-nutritive sweeteners contradicts existing scientific research. Multiple global studies have confirmed that natural sugar substitutes like erythritol and artificial sweeteners are safe for human consumption within their specified acceptable daily intake levels. The European Food Safety Authority (EFSA) assessment report released in 2025 indicates that daily erythritol intake of up to 50 grams poses no health risks for adults. The Chinese guidelines for the prevention and treatment of type 2 diabetes also explicitly state that diabetic patients may appropriately consume foods containing non-nutritive sweeteners to enhance palatability and manage blood glucose levels. While the American Diabetes Association generally supports the low-carb focus of the updated guidelines, challenges the blanket rejection of sweeteners. It argues that for individuals needing to manage weight and blood sugar, moderate sweeteners are a better choice than added sugars. This stance in the guidelines has been criticized by some nutrition experts as overly emotional, lacking sufficient scientific evidence, and driven more by policy considerations to simplify public understanding. Upon release, the guidelines ignited intense debate across the U.S. nutrition and medical communities, revealing stark divergences among authoritative bodies. The American Medical Association commended the core direction of the guidelines, noting that restrictions on highly processed foods and added sugars, coupled with the promotion of natural whole foods, align with the food as medicine health philosophy and represent an effective strategy to address the current high prevalence of diet-related chronic diseases in the United States. In a public statement, an AHA representative noted that the guidelines release signifies a major shift in U.S. public health policy from focusing on nutrients to focusing on food itself. This shift will help the public develop simpler, more science-based dietary understanding. In contrast to the IMA's supportive stance, the American Heart Association expressed clear reservations. While acknowledging the core focus on sugar and processed food control, the association voiced concerns that recommendations for red meat and full-fat dairy could lead to excessive sodium and saturated fat intake among the public. In its 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Cardiovascular Health, the American Heart Association continues to recommend low-fat and skim milk, favoring plant-based proteins, seafood, and lean meats for protein sources, while strictly limiting red meat, butter and lard. Nutrition experts from the association pointed out that the average daily sodium intake among U.S. adults has reached 3,400 milligrams, far exceeding the recommended upper limit of 2,300 milligrams. Red meat and processed meats are among the primary sources of sodium, and the guidelines' endorsement of red meat could further exacerbate excessive sodium consumption. Additionally, the association criticized the guidelines for failing to explicitly limit salt intake, calling it a glaring omission. The American Society for Nutrition and Dietetics directly highlighted two core contradictions in the new guidelines. First, the recommendations for butter, lard, red meat, and whole milk conflict with the 10% limit on saturated fat as a percentage of total calories. Following these recommended intakes, the average adult could easily exceed the saturated fat limit. Second, the guidelines' negative stance on food additives is overly emotional and lacks sufficient scientific evidence, particularly the blanket rejection of artificial sweeteners, which contradicts mainstream global scientific understanding. The association also criticized the removal of fortified soy milk from the dairy food group, arguing this adjustment disregards dietary needs for lactose-intolerant individuals. Approximately 30% of Americans are lactose intolerant, and fortified soy milk serves as a vital source of calcium and vitamin D for them. This change could lead to nutritional deficiencies among this population. The guidelines release sparked controversy not only in academic circles but also sent shockwaves through capital markets. On the day of publication, shares of companies heavily reliant on processed foods including Kraft Heinz, Mondelez International, and General Mills plummeted. Kraft Heinz fell 5.3%, Mondelez dropped 4.8%, and General Mills declined 3.6%. Wall Street analysts noted that the market volatility stems from a restructuring of dietary consumption logic. Over the past decades, these food companies have generated massive profits from high sugar, high fat, and high salt processed foods, which have maintained a stable consumer base due to their appealing taste profiles. The release of the new guidelines effectively undermines the legitimacy of such products at the policy level, significantly compressing their future market space. More critically, the dietary guidelines for Americans serve as the legal basis for public policies like the school lunch program and food stamp initiatives. The guideline revisions signal a shift in hundreds of billions of dollars in public procurement contracts. Take the school lunch program as an example. covering 98% of public schools nationwide with annual procurement reaching $28 billion. It historically favored pre-made items like frozen pizza and fried chicken nuggets. The new guidelines mandate reduced processed foods and increased cooking from scratch, shifting contracts from pre-made suppliers to fresh ingredient providers amid supply chain realignment. In stark contrast to the slump in processed food companies, stocks in livestock and fresh ingredient businesses rose against the trend. Tyson Foods shares gained 3.2%, Dean Foods shares increased 2.7%. And supermarket stocks like Whole Foods, which emphasize natural, organic, and additive-free products, climbed 4.1%. Market analysts believe the guidelines recommendations for red meat and full-fat dairy will directly boost demand for these products. U.S. full-fat dairy sales are projected to grow 15% to 20% by 2026, while unprocessed red meat sales are expected to increase 10% to 15%. Meanwhile, fresh ingredient suppliers are seizing development opportunities. Instacart, the largest U.S. grocery delivery platform, announced plans to strengthen farm partnerships and expand fresh produce and meat offerings to meet anticipated demand growth. The guidelines' implementation faces significant practical challenges. Public institutions like schools, hospitals, and nursing homes must restructure meal plans, procure fresh ingredients, train culinary staff, substantially increasing operational costs. A survey by the School Nutrition Foundation revealed that approximately 60% of public school cafeterias nationwide lack the equipment and personnel for cooking from scratch. Meeting the guidelines would require an average investment of $120,000 per school for renovations, a substantial burden for financially strained school districts. From a public perspective, natural whole foods generally cost more than processed foods. For low-income individuals, adopting the dietary pattern outlined in the guidelines would increase living expenses. Data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics indicates that by 2025, the average price of fresh vegetables in the U.S. will be 42% higher than frozen vegetables, and whole milk will cost 35% more than sugary beverages. However, the subsidy standards for the food stamp program have not been adjusted to align with the guidelines, potentially making it difficult for low-income individuals to implement the recommended dietary changes. Moreover, long-established dietary habits among Americans are difficult to alter quickly, particularly given adolescents' high dependence on processed foods and sugary drinks. Promoting the guidelines will require sustained public health advocacy and education. Expanding the perspective globally, the release of the new U.S. Dietary Guidelines has sparked widespread international discussion, with distinct differences in attitudes among various countries and international organizations. The European Food Safety Authority (EFSA) stated that while it endorses the core principles of reducing processed foods and controlling added sugars, it disagrees with the excessive recommendations regarding red meat and full-fat dairy. EFSA believes that the dietary patterns of EU residents differ from those in the US and advocates maintaining a diet pattern centered on plant-based proteins with animal proteins as a supplement. Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare pointed out that its dietary guidelines prioritize ingredient diversity and balance, and will not blindly follow US adjustments. It emphasized continued promotion of the Washoku Japanese cuisine model, as research indicates it helps reduce cardiovascular disease risk. Who offered a more objective assessment of the U.S. guidelines, acknowledging beneficial measures for addressing obesity and diabetes but noting the regret that dietary sustainability was overlooked in its 2025 guidelines for sustainable diets. Who stressed that healthy dietary patterns must not only benefit human health but also protect ecosystems by minimizing the environmental impact of food production. The U.S. guidelines support for livestock farming could increase greenhouse gas emissions, contradicting global sustainability goals. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations FAO also stated that countries should develop dietary guidelines tailored to their resource endowments, food cultures, and public health conditions. Developing nations, in particular, should avoid blindly adopting the American model and instead prioritize balancing food security with health. Comparing China's dietary guidelines further highlights the divergence in dietary philosophies between the two nations. In May 2025, China's National Nutrition and Health Guidance Committee released the updated Dietary Guidelines for Chinese residents. While also addressing obesity concerns, data indicates China's adult overweight and obesity rate has reached 51.2%, potentially exceeding 70% by 2030 without intervention. Its specific recommendations are more tailored to China's national context. The Chinese guidelines advocate increasing intake of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and aquatic products. They recommend adults consume over 300 grams of fresh vegetables, 200 to 350 grams of fresh fruit daily, and 300 to 500 g of fish, shrimp, and other aquatic products weekly. For protein choices, they adhere to the principle of combining animal and plant proteins and do not prioritize red meat. For dairy products, adults are recommended to consume 300 to 500 milliliters of milk and dairy products daily, significantly lower than the US guidelines 710 to 720 milliliters standard. The Chinese guidelines also emphasize dietary sustainability, encouraging the selection of local, seasonal ingredients and reducing food waste, a stark contrast to the US approach. Experts from the Chinese Nutrition Society state that the new US guidelines were developed based on its own public health crises and industry interests and cannot be directly applied to China. From an industrial capacity perspective, China's dairy production cannot support a national daily consumption of 710 to 720 milliliters per person. From a dietary culture perspective, the long-established carbohydrate-centric eating patterns of the Chinese population are difficult to change in the short term. Regarding public health status, a significant proportion of Chinese residents exhibit lactose intolerance, and excessive consumption of whole milk may cause gastrointestinal discomfort. Furthermore, China's chronic disease spectrum differs from that of the US. The primary trigger for cardiovascular disease in China is high-salt diets rather than high-saturated fat diets. Consequently, China's guidelines emphasize salt control, recommending that adults consume no more than 5 grams of salt daily. Returning to the core value of the new US guidelines, setting aside controversies lies their reminder to return to the fundamentals of healthy eating, eliminate highly processed foods, avoid refined carbohydrates, reduce sugary drinks, and prioritize natural, whole, unprocessed foods. The release of these guidelines signals a global shift in the food industry, moving away from a phase of rapid development focused on efficiency and palatability back toward an era centered on health and authenticity. In the US, natural and organic supermarkets like Whole Foods have gained popularity. In China, consumers increasingly favor short shelf-life foods with clean ingredient lists in supermarkets. These market signals indicate rising consumer demand for healthy foods. Future food premiums will stem not from more complex processing, but from simpler ingredient lists. Several details in the guidelines warrant attention. The document makes no mention of cholesterol and offers no explicit recommendation for egg consumption. Aligning with nutritional science research, 1 egg per day for adults is sufficient to meet bodily needs consistent with China's dietary guidelines. The guidelines eliminate previous gender-specific alcohol limits, replacing the 2 drinks day for men and 1 drink per day for women with the principle that alcohol consumption should be minimized for health benefits. They explicitly state that pregnant women and individuals with a history of alcohol abuse should abstain entirely, aligning with global mainstream health recommendations on alcohol. Furthermore, The guidelines explicitly state for the first time that individuals with metabolic disorders such as abnormal blood glucose levels or diabetes can improve their health through a moderately low-carbohydrate, high-protein dietary pattern. This offers new insights for dietary management in chronic disease patients, though it emphasizes the necessity of professional medical or nutritional guidance to avoid health risks from unsupervised dietary adjustments. Historically, the evolution of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines itself reflects the iterative progress of nutritional science. The 1980 edition advocated low-fat diets, identifying fat as the primary cause of cardiovascular disease. The 2005 version began focusing on processed foods, recommending reduced trans fat intake. The 2015 guidelines removed dietary cholesterol restrictions, acknowledging its limited health impact. The 2025 edition marks a shift from nutrient-focused to food-focused principles. Each adjustment reflects contemporary scientific understanding and societal needs, accompanied by controversy and negotiation. As noted by renowned American author Michael Pollan, eat real food, not too much, mostly plants. This seemingly simple statement took humanity half a century of detours and significant health costs to rediscover. For Chinese residents, there is no need to treat the new U.S. guidelines as gospel. The Dietary Guidelines for Chinese Residents 2025 should remain the core reference, with personalized dietary plans developed based on individual health conditions and eating habits. Due to the controversy surrounding the U.S. guidelines offers valuable insights. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for dietary health. Any dietary guidelines must strike a balance between scientific evidence, public health objectives, and industry interests, while also accounting for a nation's unique circumstances and cultural traditions. Whether it's America's high-protein priority or China's balanced and diverse approach, the ultimate goal remains guiding the public toward healthy eating patterns and reducing the risk of diet-related chronic diseases. The release of the new U.S. Dietary Guidelines represents less of a revolution in nutrition science and more of a policy adjustment within a specific societal context. It possesses both sound core principles and notable controversies. While offering fresh perspectives on global dietary health, it also exposes the complex dynamics of public policy formulation. Amid this global shift in dietary philosophy, consumers must prioritize rational thinking over blind trends. Guided by scientific evidence, they should choose healthy eating approaches tailored to their individual needs. Ultimately, returning to the essence of food itself is the foundation of healthy eating. Eating the core principle all dietary guidelines ultimately aim to convey